The 72nd floor of Grayson Tower gleamed under the cold glow of neon lights, a cathedral of glass and steel piercing the New York skyline. Edward Grayson stood at the edge of his office, hands clasped behind his back, gazing down at the city that sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom. At 55, he was a man chiseled by discipline. Broad shoulders, squared beneath a tailored black suit, silver threading his dark hair, and eyes sharp as the edge of a blade. The desk behind him, a slab of polished ebony, bore no personal touches save for a single item, an old pocket watch, its brass dulled by time, its hands frozen at 3:17. He didn't know why he kept it, or perhaps he did, and the truth was too heavy to admit. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Edward's life was a testament to control, every meeting scheduled, every deal calculated, every emotion locked away. He had built this empire from nothing, clawing his way up from a cramped Brooklyn apartment to the pinnacle of wealth. "I don't need anyone," he murmured to himself, his voice low and steady, a mantra carved into his soul. The words echoed off the glass unanswered. That evening, as he returned to his white marble mansion in the Upper East Side, the ritual was the same. Dinner for one, a single plate of seared salmon, a glass of bourbon, and the clink of silverware against porcelain in a dining room built for 20. The empty chairs stared back at him, silent witnesses to a life of triumph without warmth. He ate methodically, his movements precise, then carried the half-finished plate to the kitchen himself. No staff lingered after dusk. He preferred it that way. Opening the refrigerator, he slid the leftovers onto a shelf, his gaze catching on the pocket watch he'd left on the counter earlier. Why did he still have it? 30 years, and it hadn't ticked once. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, and turned off the lights. The next morning, the rhythm of his world shifted. Edward sat at his desk, reviewing quarterly reports, when a faint commotion stirred outside his office. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped in. Lily, a new temp cleaner, her uniform frayed at the hem, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Behind her trailed a small girl, no more than 6, with wide, curious eyes and a tangle of curls. Sophie, Lily had called her when she'd apologized for bringing the child. "No one to watch her today," she'd said, voice firm despite the exhaustion in her posture. Edward had nodded curtly, suppressing his irritation. Children didn't belong here. He returned to his papers, but a rustle drew his attention. Sophie had wandered closer, her tiny fingers brushing the edge of his desk. Before he could speak, she reached into his open suit jacket, hanging on the chair, and the pocket watch slipped free, clattering to the hardwood floor. The sound was a gunshot in the stillness. Edward's head snapped up, his jaw tightening, but he held his tongue. The girl froze, then crouched to pick it up, her face bright with innocence. "Mama says this looks like Grandpa's watch," Sophie chirped, holding it up as if it were a treasure. Her voice was clear, unguarded, slicing through the air like a bell. Edward's breath caught. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and took the watch from her small hands. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, his tone low, controlled, though a tremor flickered beneath it. Lily stepped forward, pulling Sophie back with a gentle but firm grip. "She's just talking nonsense," Lily said, her eyes meeting his briefly, steady, unyielding, the eyes of someone who'd faced worse than a stern CEO. "Sorry about the trouble. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Edward replied, his voice a quiet command. He waved them out, watching as Lily guided Sophie through the door, the girl's curls bouncing with each step. The office fell silent again, but it wasn't the same. Sophie's words lingered. A pebble dropped into the still waters of his mind. He sat back down, the watch resting in his palm. Grandpa's watch. Ridiculous. Yet those eyes, Sophie's eyes, had stirred something, a memory he'd buried deep. Clara. The name surfaced unbidden, sharp as a blade against his ribs. Clara, with her soft laughter and softer hands, The woman he'd loved in a life before this one. He'd walked away from her 30 years ago, choosing ambition over her pleas, her tears staining the doorstep of their crumbling apartment. "You'll regret this, Edward," she'd said, her voice breaking. He hadn't looked back. Now, staring at the watch, he felt the first crack in his armor. It wasn't the words. It was the girl. Something in her gaze, her fearless curiosity, echoed Clara in a way that defied reason. Edward clenched his fist around the watch, the metal cool against his skin. "I don't owe anyone," he whispered again. But the conviction faltered. That night, back in the mansion, he skipped dinner. The plate stayed empty, the bourbon untouched. He stood in the kitchen, the watch on the counter beside him, its stillness mocking his own. Why had he kept it? He could have thrown it away years ago, sold it, melted it down. Instead, it followed him, a shadow he couldn't shake. He traced its edges with a finger, remembering Clara's hand slipping it into his coat the last time they'd spoken. "Something to remember me by," she'd said, her smile fragile. Edward turned away, leaving the watch where it lay. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, the mansion's silence heavier than ever. As he closed his eyes, Sophie's voice echoed, "In the dark, Grandpa's watch." And for the first time in decades, he wondered what he'd left behind. Not money, not power, but something else. Something he couldn't name. Edward Grayson sat at his desk, the pocket watch resting in, his palm like a relic from a war he'd long since won, or so he'd told himself. The 72nd floor was quiet, the city's hum a distant whisper beyond the glass. Yesterday's encounter with Sophie gnawed at him. Her words, Grandpa's watch, looping in his mind like a record stuck on a scratch. He'd dismissed Lily and her daughter with the same cool precision he applied to every problem, but the unease lingered, a splinter under his skin. He closed his eyes, and the past rushed in uninvited. A cramped apartment in Brooklyn, walls thin as paper, the air thick with the scent of chamomile tea brewing in a chipped kettle. Clara stood by the stove, her dark hair spilling over one shoulder, her hands steady as she poured steaming liquid into a mismatched cup. She'd been 22 then, her laughter a balm to the chaos of his ambition. Edward saw himself at her side, younger, leaner, his fingers tracing the worn fabric of a shirt she'd mended for him. "You don't have to keep fixing me," he'd teased, and she'd smiled, soft and sure. "Someone has to." That was before the choice, before the ultimatum from his father's voice in his head. "You'll never be anything if you stay with her." And the siren call of Wall Street. He'd stood in that doorway, Clara's eyes pleading as she gripped the kettle's handle. "I need to do this, Clara," he'd said, his voice firm, unshaken. "I can't fail. You don't understand what's at stake." Her tears had fallen, silently staining the cracked linoleum. "I understand more than you think," she'd whispered. "Stay, Edward. We'll make it work." But he'd turned away, promising he'd come back when he'd made something of himself. The door clicked shut, and he hadn't looked back. Now, 30 years later, he opened his eyes to the sterile glow of his office. The memory stung, sharp and unexpected, but Edward's face remained a mask. Discipline was his shield, control his sword. He didn't bend to sentiment. He forged ahead. Yet Sophie's voice, her uncanny resemblance to Clara, had pried open a crack he couldn't seal. He set the watch down and pressed the intercom. "Send the cleaner in," he said, his tone even, betraying nothing. Lily entered moments later, alone this time, her posture rigid but her gaze unflinching. She was 28, Edward guessed, her features hardened by years he couldn't imagine. Her uniform hung loose, the sleeves frayed, a quiet testament to a life of scraping by. He studied her, searching for Clara in the line of her jaw, the stubborn tilt of her chin. "Your daughter mentioned a grandfather yesterday," he began, keeping his voice steady. "Where did she get that idea?" Lily's eyes narrowed, but she didn't falter. "Kids say things. She doesn't know what she's talking about." Her words were clipped, a wall built from necessity. Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, the watch glinting between them. She said it looked like his watch. He pressed, his tone calm but insistent. What did your mother tell you about him? Lily's mouth tightened, a flicker of something, grief, defiance, crossing her face. My mother was Clara, she said, her voice low, deliberate. She told me, my father chose money over us, said he walked away and never looked back. She died when I was 17, left me an old teapot and a story I didn't need. I don't care who he was, or is. She paused, her gaze locking with his. That's all I've got. Can I go now? Edward nodded, his expression unchanged, though his chest tightened. Yes, he said simply, watching as she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Clara. The name hit him like a stone, but he didn't flinch. He sat back, staring at the watch, its frozen hands mocking. His composure. Lily's words spun in his head, chose money over us, and the pieces began to align, jagged and unwelcome. He reached into his drawer, pulling out a small plastic bag he kept for stray items, a habit of orderliness. When Lily had left yesterday, he'd found a single strand of Sophie's dark hair on the floor where she'd stood. Now he slipped it into the bag, sealing it with a precision that belied the storm inside him. He'd send it for a DNA test, he decided. Not because he believed, not yet, but because he needed certainty. Just to be sure, he murmured, the lie thin even to his own ears. That night, the mansion felt colder. Edward skipped dinner again, the kitchen untouched save for a glass of water he poured and left half full. He stood by the counter, the watch beside him, its brass catching the dim light. Clara's teapot. He could see it still, chipped and sturdy, the last thing she'd held as he walked away. Had she kept it all those years? Had she poured tea for Lily with the same quiet grace she'd shown him? The thought clawed at him, but he pushed it down, his breathing measured, his hands steady. He wasn't a man who broke. He'd faced boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, and public scrutiny without blinking. This was no different. A question to be answered, a problem to be solved. Yet as he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, the weight of Lily's defiance lingered. I don't care who he is, she'd said, and the words cut deeper than he'd expected. Not anger, not accusation, just indifference. It was worse than he'd imagined. Lying in the dark, Edward stared at the ceiling, the watch's silence, louder than ever. He saw Clara again, her tears, her plea, and for the first time in decades, he wondered what she'd carried after he'd gone. A child? His child? The possibility hung there, heavy and real, but he closed his eyes against it. I don't owe anyone, he whispered, the old mantra a fragile shield. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams of a teapot steaming on a stove, a promise lost in the steam. Edward Grayson stood alone in his bedroom, the mansion's silence pressing against him like a weight. Rain tapped the floor-to-ceiling windows, a steady rhythm that matched the thud of his pulse. 3 days had passed since he'd sent Sophie's hair for testing, and now the envelope lay on his dresser, unopened, its crisp white edge glaring in the dim light. He didn't need to read it. He knew. The truth had been creeping closer since Lily's words sliced through his office, since Sophie's eyes mirrored Clara's in a way he couldn't deny. But knowing and facing it were different beasts. He turned away from the envelope, his movements deliberate, and crossed to the closet. Hidden behind a row of tailored suits was a safe, its surface dulled by years of neglect. He punched in the code, his birth year, a number Clara had once teased him for using, and the door clicked open. Inside, among stock certificates and old contracts, was a small wooden box, its lid etched with a simple vine pattern. Clara's gift, given the night before he'd left her. He hadn't opened it since. Edward carried the box to the bed, rain streaking the glass behind him, and lifted the lid. A stack of letters spilled out, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Clara's handwriting curling across the envelopes in tight, careful loops. He'd found them years ago, shoved into his mailbox after a business trip, and stuffed them here without a glance. Now his fingers hesitated, then untied the ribbon. The first letter bore a postmark from 30 years back, months after their parting. "Edward," it began, her voice leaping off the page, soft but firm. "I didn't want to write this, but you deserve to know. I'm pregnant. Her name will be Lily, after my grandmother. I won't ask you to come back. I know you've made your choice. But she's yours too." His breath hitched, but he kept reading, his face a mask of control. Another letter, years later. "Lily's 3 now. She asked about you today. And I didn't know what to say. I saw you in the paper. Young tycoon rises. I'm proud, Edward, but it hurts." A third, from when Lily was 10. "She's strong like you. I don't need your money or your name. I just want you to know she exists." The final letter was dated 15 years ago, the ink smudged, as if written in haste. "Lily's 17. I'm sick, Edward. Cancer. I won't make it much longer. I never told her who you are. She deserves better than a father who walked away. This is goodbye." His hands trembled, but he set the letter down with precision, his jaw tight. Clara was gone. Lily was his. The DNA results were a formality now. This was the proof, raw and undeniable. He rose, needing air, and stepped onto the balcony. Rain soaked his shirt, but he didn't flinch. Clara had carried their daughter alone, raised her in shadows while he built towers of glass. The weight of it pressed against his chest. But Edward Grayson didn't break. He stood tall, rain dripping from his silver hair, and let the truth settle. He'd abandoned more than a lover. He'd abandoned a family. Yet even now, he couldn't let the mask slip. Dignity was all he had left. The next morning, he drove to a modest brownstone in Queens, the address pulled from an old contact Clara had once scribbled down. Margaret, her best friend, lived there still, a retired nurse with gray curls and a gaze that cut through pretense. Edward knocked, his posture rigid, and she opened the door, her eyes narrowing at the sight of him. "You've got nerve showing up here," Margaret said, her voice sharp but steady. She didn't invite him in, so he stood on the stoop. Rain, from the night still clinging to his coat. "I need to know about Clara," he said, his tone even, though his hands clenched at his sides. "About Lily," Margaret crossed her arms. "You broke her, Edward. She loved you, and you left her with nothing but a baby and a broken heart. She worked double shifts, lived in a rat trap, all to keep Lily fed. Never took a dime from your fancy family when they offered, said it'd taint her pride." Her words landed like blows, but Edward's face remained still, absorbing them. "She died alone, coughing her lungs out while you sat in your tower. What do you want now?" "To understand," he said quietly. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," she shot back. "You walked away because your honor was tied to money, not her. Now what? You think showing up fixes anything?" Edward met her gaze, unflinching. "No, but I owe her the truth." He paused, then added, "And Lily." Margaret studied him, her expression softening just a fraction. "Clara kept you a secret. Lily doesn't know. She's tough like her mother. Raised that little girl, Sophie, on her own. Don't drag them into your mess unless you're ready to be a man, not a mogul." He nodded, a single measured motion, and turned to leave. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavier. Back in his car, he sat with the letters beside him, Clara's words burning in his mind. Lily was his daughter, his blood, and he'd let her grow up in hardship while he chased a throne. The shame was a quiet fire, but Edward didn't let it consume him. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and made a choice. He wouldn't storm into Lily's life, not yet. He'd watch, learn, and find a way to face her without shattering the dignity she'd inherited from Clara. That night, he returned to the mansion, the box of letters on his desk. He didn't cry. He wasn't built for it. Instead, he poured a glass of water, drank it slowly, and stared at the watch. Its hands were still, but something in him had begun to move. Honor, he realized, wasn't the empire he'd built. Was the debt he'd ignored, and the chance to repay it, one careful step at a time. Edward Grayson adjusted his tie in the mirrored wall of the elevator, the hum of its ascent a steady counterpoint to the storm brewing inside him. The letters from Clara sat locked in his safe, their weight heavier than the steel doors sliding open to the 72nd floor. 3 days had passed since Margaret's words, "You broke her," and the truth of Lily's lineage had settled into his bones. He hadn't approached her yet, unsure how to bridge 30 years of silence. Instead, he watched from afar, his discipline a lifeline as he navigated the revelation. Tonight, though, was different. The annual Grayson Enterprises Gala filled the penthouse ballroom with a glittering throng, executives in tuxedos, heiresses in sequins, the clink of champagne flutes cutting through the murmur of power plays. Edward stood near the bar, his posture impeccable, a glass of tonic water in hand. He didn't drink at these events. Control was his currency. The room buzzed with admiration, but he felt its emptiness, a hollow echo of the life he'd built. A shadow fell across his view. Victor Crane, lean and sharp-eyed, approached with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. At 42, Victor was a rising star in the financial world, a predator who'd made his fortune shorting Edward's competitors. They'd clashed before, but tonight, Victor's gaze held a new edge. "Grayson," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "You're the king of this castle, aren't you? Untouchable. Or so they say." Edward met his stare, unflinching. "I don't play games, Crane. Say what you mean." Victor sipped his drink, a calculated pause. Words getting around. Something about a janitor and her kid hanging around. "Your office. People talk, especially when the great Edward Grayson starts looking human." His smile widened, a blade unsheathed. "Dignity's a fragile thing, isn't it?" The barb landed, but Edward's expression didn't shift. "I don't answer to rumors," he said, his tone low, steady. "Or to you." He turned away, dismissing Victor, but the man's laughter followed him, a sound that promised trouble. By morning, the rumors had teeth. Tabloids splashed headlines across newsstands. Billionaire's secret life, Grayson linked to mystery cleaner. Grainy photos showed Lily mopping a hallway, Sophie trailing behind, and Edward watching from a distance. The story was thin, built on speculation, but it spread like wildfire. His assistant, a wiry man named Paul, dropped a stack of papers on his desk. "The board's antsy," Paul said. "They want a statement. Victor's fanning the flames. He's got contacts at the Post." Edward skimmed the articles, his jaw tight but his hands steady. "Let them talk," he said. "It'll burn out." But inwardly, he felt the pressure mounting, a test of the honor he'd long defined by success. Lily didn't deserve this. Not her, not Sophie. He made a call to HR, his voice clipped. "Move the temp cleaner to an assistant role. Back office, no questions." It wasn't an apology. It was a shield, the least he could do without crossing a line he wasn't ready to face. Days later, he saw Sophie again. Lily had brought her to the office, unavoidable, she'd said, with no sitter, and Edward found them in the break room. Lily sorted files, her movements brisk, while Sophie sat on the floor, coloring a dog with a blue crayon. Edward paused, in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the girl's small hands move with purpose. She looked up, her face breaking into a grin. "Hi, Mr. Serious." He almost smiled. Almost. "Hello, Sophie," he said, stepping inside. Lily glanced over, her expression guarded, but she didn't stop him. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the drawing. "My puppy," Sophie said proudly. "He likes ice cream." She held up the paper, and a smudge of blue crayon streaked her cheek. Edward hesitated, then pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, monogrammed, pristine, and knelt to wipe the mark away. "Ice cream, huh?" he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "What kind?" "Chocolate," she chirped, giggling as he dabbed her face. For a moment, the world shrank to this, the rustle of paper, her laughter, the faint warmth of her trust. Lily watched, silent, her eyes unreadable. "Sophie, let him work," she said finally, but there was no bite in it. Edward stood, folding the handkerchief with care, and nodded to her. Keep the drawing, he said to Sophie. It's a good one. He left the room, his chest tight, the memory of Clara's laughter echoing in the girls. That afternoon, he slipped out, driving. To a corner store near the office, he returned with a small chocolate cone, leaving it on Lily's desk with a note. For the artist. No signature. He wasn't ready for that. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. The next day, a reporter cornered him outside the tower. Microphone, thrust forward. Mr. Grayson, what's your relationship with the cleaner's kid? People are saying she's yours. Edward stopped, his face a wall of calm, though his pulse quickened. I don't comment on nonsense, he said, his voice firm, measured. My business is my company, not my personal life. He pushed past, ignoring the shouts, and entered the building. Inside, Victor waited by the elevator, arms crossed. Nice dodge, Victor said, his tone mocking. But secrets don't stay buried. What's the kid to you, Grayson? Your dignity's on the line. Edward stepped closer, his eyes locking with Victor's, but his voice stayed low, controlled. My dignity's mine to define, not yours to question. Step carefully, Crane. He entered the elevator, the doors closing on Victor's smirk. That night in the mansion, Edward stood by the kitchen counter, the watch beside him. The headlines, the whispers, Victor's taunts, they circled like vultures, but he didn't falter. He poured a glass of water, drank it slowly, and thought of Sophie's crayon-smudged cheek. Clara's blood ran in her veins and in Lily's. His blood, too. The realization was a quiet thunder, but Edward didn't rage or despair. He set the glass down, his movements precise, and made a vow to himself. He'd protect them, not with power, but with the honor he'd neglected too long. The spotlight burned, but he'd face it standing tall. The air in the Grayson Enterprises conference hall crackled with tension, a storm brewing beneath the polished veneer of corporate power. Edward Grayson stood at the podium, his black suit crisp, his silver hair catching the harsh glare of overhead lights. Beyond the glass walls, New York pulsed with indifference, but here, the room brimmed with expectation. Reporters in the front rows, cameras flashing, and the board of directors seated stiffly behind him. The headlines had spiraled out of control. Grayson's secret family? Screamed one. Billionaires fall from grace? Taunted another. Victor Crane had lit the match, and now the fire raged. Edward's hands rested lightly on the podium, steady as stone, though his pulse thrummed beneath his cuffs. He'd called this press conference himself, a calculated move to face the storm head-on. Victor stood near the back, arms crossed, his lean frame a silhouette of smug anticipation. The man had orchestrated this, leaked photos, whispered lies, turning Edward's quiet observation of Lily and Sophie into a public spectacle. But Edward didn't flinch. Dignity wasn't a gift from others, it was forged within. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice low, resonant, cutting through the murmurs. You're here because of rumors. I'm here to set the record straight. The room hushed, pens poised, lenses trained on him. My personal life is not your business nor my company's. I've built Grayson Enterprises on results, not gossip. That's all I'll say. A reporter shot up, his voice sharp. Mr. Grayson, are you denying the child is yours? Sources say you've been favoring the cleaner. Promotions, gifts. What's the truth? Edward's gaze didn't waver. I don't owe you an explanation, he said evenly. I favor competence, not connections. Next question. His calm was a wall, unyielding, but the cracks in his armor widened with each jab. He saw Lily's face in his mind, her defiance, her strength, and Sophie's crayon-smudged smile. They didn't deserve this circus. Another voice piped up, bolder. Victor Crane claims you're hiding a daughter to protect your image. Care to comment? The room buzzed, heads turning to Victor, who offered a thin, predatory smile. Edward's jaw tightened, but his tone remained measured. Mr. Crane can claim what he likes. I answer to my conscience, not his ambition. He stepped back, signaling the end. But the board's chair, a grizzled man named Hargrove, leaned forward, his whisper sharp in Edward's ear. We need more, Grayson. The stock's dipping. Deny it outright or step aside. The ultimatum hung heavy, a blade at his throat. Edward straightened, his silence a refusal, and walked off the stage. The cameras erupted, shouts trailing him like hounds. He found Lily in the back office, sorting files with the same fierce focus he'd seen in Clara. Sophie sat nearby, swinging her legs from a chair, a half-eaten chocolate cone melting in her hand, the one he'd left days ago. Lily looked up as he entered, her eyes narrowing. "What's going on out there?" she demanded, her voice low but edged. "They're saying things. About me. About Sophie. Did you start this?" Edward stopped, his chest tightening. "No," he said, his tone steady despite the storm inside. "I didn't. But it's my fault it's reached you." He paused, choosing his words with care. "Someone's digging into my life, and they've dragged you in." Lily set the files down, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear, but with fury. "Dragged us in?" she echoed. "You promoted me out of nowhere, left ice cream like some saint. Now they're calling me your mistress, Sophie, your bastard. You think you can play God with us?" Her voice rose, sharp and raw. "Tell me the truth, are you behind this?" Sophie's head snapped up, her small face crumpling. "Mama, don't yell," she said, her voice quivering. She slid off the chair and ran to Edward, clutching his leg, the sticky cone smearing. His trousers. "Mr. Serious didn't do anything bad." Edward froze, the warmth of her grip piercing his resolve. He knelt, meeting her tear-streaked eyes, and wiped her cheek with his sleeve, ruining the pristine fabric without a second thought. "I'm not good at this, Sophie," he said softly. "But I'm not lying to your mama. I didn't start this." Lily stepped closer, her anger faltering as she saw Sophie's trust. "Then why us?" she pressed, quieter now. "Why do they care?" He stood, facing her, his voice low but firm. "Because I've been watching you. Not to use you. To understand you. I'm not who you think I am." The confession hung there, incomplete, but it was all he could offer without shattering everything. Lily's gaze searched his, probing for cracks, but she found none. Before she could respond, Paul burst in, breathless. "They're outside. Reporters, Victor, the board. They want you gone, Edward. Now." Edward nodded, his expression unyielding. "Let them wait." He turned to Lily. "Stay here. Keep her safe." Then he walked out, Sophie's small handprint a silent mark on his leg. The hallway was a gauntlet, flashes blinding, voices shouting. "Is she your daughter, Grayson? Step down or come clean." Victor blocked his path, his smirk a taunt. "You're finished," he said. "Your dignity's a sham. Hiding a kid all these years. Admit it." Edward stopped, inches from him, his eyes cold but calm. "I don't hide," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "I protect what matters. You wouldn't understand." He pushed past, ignoring the chaos, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, muffling the uproar, but not the choice ahead. Alone, he leaned against the wall, Sophie's tears and Lily's accusations swirling in his mind. Clara's words from her last letter surfaced. "Don't let Lily suffer like I did." The board could take his title, Victor, his reputation, but he wouldn't let them take his daughter's peace. Not again. He straightened, his resolve hardening. He'd face them all, reporters, enemies, himself, with the truth, not because they demanded it, but because honor required it. The elevator dinged, and Edward stepped out, ready to fight the only way he knew how, with dignity and tact. Rain hammered the city, a relentless drumbeat against the roof of Edward Grayson's Bentley. As he drove through the narrow streets of Queens, the press conference lingered in his mind, Victor's smirk, the board's ultimatum, Lily's piercing question. But he pushed them aside, his hands steady on the wheel. The truth burned in his chest, a fire he could no longer contain. Lily deserved to know who he was, not through tabloid lies or whispered rumors, but from him. He'd spent 30 years building walls. Tonight, he'd start tearing them down. He parked outside Lily's apartment, a sagging brick building with cracked windows and a flickering street lamp casting shadows on the wet pavement. Rain soaked his suit as he stepped out. but he didn't hesitate. The climb to the third floor was slow, deliberate, each step echoing the weight of Clara's letters in his jacket pocket. He knocked, the sound muffled by the storm, and waited. Lily opened the door, her dark hair damp, her eyes wary. Behind her, Sophie peeked out, clutching a stuffed bear, her small face brightening at the sight of him. "Mr. Serious," she chirped, but Lily's hand tightened on the knob. "What are you doing here?" Lily asked, her voice low, guarded. The apartment smelled of damp wood and faint chamomile, Clara's tea, a ghost in the air. Water dripped from a leak into a rusted bucket near the couch, a steady plink underscoring the tension. Edward stood in the doorway, rain streaking his face, but his posture remained tall. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone calm, measured. "It's important." Lily hesitated, then stepped aside. "5 minutes," she said, crossing her arms. Sophie scampered to his side, tugging his sleeve, but he gently guided her to the couch, kneeling to her level. "Stay here, Sophie," he said softly. "I need to tell your mama something." She nodded, hugging her bear, and he rose, facing Lily. The words he'd rehearsed faltered, but he pressed on, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "I'm your father, Lily. I was with Clara, your mother, 30 years ago. I left her, and I didn't know about you until now." The room went still, the rain's rhythm the only sound. Lily's face hardened, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You're lying," she said, her voice ablade. "My father was a coward who ran. You're Edward Grayson, billionaire, untouchable. Why would you—" She stopped, her breath catching as the pieces clicked. "The promotion, the ice cream. You knew." "I suspected," he corrected, his gaze unflinching. "I confirmed it with DNA, then found her letters. She never told me. I didn't look back. My fault, not hers." He pulled the damp stack from his pocket, holding them out. "Read them. She wanted you to have a life free of me." Lily snatched the letters, her hands shaking as she tore into the first one. Her eyes scanned Clara's tight script, the words spilling out in a whisper. "Lily's yours. I won't beg him back. She deserves better." She flipped to another, then the last, her voice breaking. "She was dying, and you." She stopped, staring at him, fury and grief warring in her gaze. "You let her suffer. You let us suffer." Edward didn't look away, though her words cut deeper than Victor's taunts. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I was blind, chasing a life that meant nothing. I can't undo that, but I'm here now." "Here now?" Lily laughed, bitter and raw. "You think that fixes it? She worked herself to death, waitressing, cleaning, coughing up blood, while you sat in your tower. She kept your secret, and I grew up with nothing. You don't get to waltz in and play father." Sophie whimpered, sliding off the couch. "Mama, stop," she said, her small voice trembling. She ran to Edward, wrapping her arms around his leg, rain-soaked trousers and all. "Don't go, Grandpa Serious. I like you." Her tears soaked into his knee, and Edward's throat tightened. He knelt again, brushing a curl from her face. "I'm not going anywhere unless your mama says so," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. He looked up at Lily, rain dripping from his hair. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I won't run again. Not from you, not from her." Lily's anger faltered, her eyes darting between Sophie's trust and the letters in her hand. She sank onto the couch, clutching the pages, and pulled a worn journal from a drawer. Clara's, its cover frayed. She flipped to a marked page, reading aloud, her voice shaking. "I could have taken his family's money, Lily. They offered when he started climbing. But I said no. I wanted you to grow up free, not chained to his world." She looked at Edward, tears brimming. "She sacrificed everything to keep me from you." The twist hit Edward like a quiet blow. Clara's pride, her silent strength, shielding Lily from his shadow. He stood, rain pooling at his feet, and nodded. Was better than me, he said, his voice low, steady. I'm learning that too late. Lily wiped her eyes, her resolve softening as Sophie clung to him. She forgave you, she said finally. In her last entry, she did. But I can't. Not yet. She paused, her gaze piercing. Why tell me now? Because you deserve the truth, he replied. Not the papers, not Crane, me. I've got nothing left to prove except this. He stepped back, giving her space. I'll wait outside, however long it takes. He turned, walking into the rain, and stood under the street lamp, soaked to the bone. The storm raged, but Edward didn't move, his silhouette unwavering. Inside, Lily watched, Sophie's small hand in hers, the journal open between them. Clara's sacrifice had kept them apart. Now, Edward's resolve might bring them together. The rain fell, and for the first time he felt the weight of honor, not in wealth but in standing still, waiting for a chance to make it right. The rain had faded to a drizzle by morning, leaving the air crisp and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Edward Grayson sat on a park bench near Lily's apartment, his suit still damp from the night before, his silver hair plastered to his forehead. He hadn't slept, but his posture remained straight, the pocket watch resting in his hand. He'd waited outside her door until dawn, a silent sentinel, giving her space to process his confession. The truth was out. Lily was his daughter. Sophie, his granddaughter. And now he waited for her verdict, not with demands, but with a patience he'd never known he possessed. The park was quiet, save for the chirping of sparrows and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Edward traced the watch's worn edges, its hands still frozen at 3:17, the moment Clara had slipped it into his pocket, a farewell he hadn't understood. He'd carried it for 30 years, a relic of his failure, but today, it felt different. Lighter. He pulled a small screwdriver from his coat, a tool he'd grabbed from his car on impulse, and began to work, his fingers steady as he pried open the back. The gears were rusted, stuck, but he cleaned them with care, winding the spring until, with a faint tick, it stirred to life. Time started again. The creak of a door broke his focus. Lily emerged from the building, Sophie at her side, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She paused, spotting him, then walked over, her steps measured. Sophie broke free, running to him with a grin. "Grandpa's serious. You're still here," she said, climbing onto the bench. Edward set the watch down, steadying her with a hand, his heart catching at the title she'd given him. "I told you I wouldn't go," he said, his voice soft but firm. He looked up at Lily, who stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "I meant it." Lily crossed her arms, the journal, Clara's, tucked, under one elbow. "You're stubborn," she said, her tone dry but lacking the edge of last night. "Sophie wouldn't stop talking about you, said you're her hero now." She glanced at her daughter, then back at him. "I don't trust you, Edward, but she does. That's why I'm here." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "I don't expect trust," he said. "I haven't earned it, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me." He held up the watch, its faint ticking audible in the stillness. "I fixed this. It's yours, Sophie. Time I should have given you both." Sophie took it, her eyes wide. "It works," she exclaimed, pressing it to her ear. "Can I wind it, Grandpa?" "I'll show you," he said, guiding her small fingers to the stem. "Turn it gently, there you go." She beamed as the hands moved, and Edward felt a warmth he hadn't known in decades. Lily watched, her gaze softening, though her stance remained guarded. "I read the rest of her journal," Lily said, stepping closer. "She wanted me to hate you, but she couldn't. Said you were lost, not cruel. I don't know what to make of that." She paused, then added, "I'm not ready to call you anything, but Sophie's right. You're here. That's something." Edward met her eyes, his voice steady. "It's a start. I'll take it." He stood brushing damp leaves from his trousers. "Let's get you both out of the cold. Breakfast?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but you're buying. They walked to a diner nearby, a small place with chipped formica tables and the smell of brewing coffee. Edward ordered pancakes for Sophie, tea for Lily, chamomile like Clara's, and a black coffee for himself. He fumbled with the teapot, spilling a little as he poured, and Sophie giggled. "You're messy, Grandpa," she said, dipping her finger in the puddle. "I'm learning," he replied, a rare half-smile tugging at his lips. He wiped the table with a napkin, his movements careful, and handed Lily the cup. Clara was better at this. She was, Lily agreed, her voice softening. She'd have liked this, though, us here. She sipped the tea, her eyes distant, then added, "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," he said, watching Sophie smear syrup on her chin. "You're stronger than I ever was." Back at the tower, the fallout waited. Edward returned to find Paul pacing his office, a fax in hand. "The board's voting today," Paul said, breathless. "Victor's pushing for your seat, says you're a liability. Stock's down 5%. Edward skimmed the memo, his face impassive. "Let them vote," he said, setting it down. "I'm stepping down." Paul blinked. "What? You built this company? And it'll stand without me," Edward cut in, his tone firm but calm. "I've got something else to build now." He walked to his desk, pulling out a resignation letter he'd drafted that morning, and signed it with a steady hand. Victor could have the throne. Edward's honor lay elsewhere. That evening he met Lily and Sophie at Clara's old apartment, a tiny space Lily had kept as a rental. The kitchen was cramped, the teapot chipped, but it felt alive with Sophie's chatter. Edward tried brewing tea again, spilling less this time, and Sophie clapped. "You're getting good," she said. "Practice," he replied, handing Lily a cup. She took it, a faint smile breaking through. "You're starting to sound like her," she said. "Stubborn but steady." Edward nodded, his voice low. "Honor's not what people see. It's what you hold on to. I'm holding this." He gestured to the room, to them. Outside, Victor's victory hit the news, Grayson ousted in boardroom coup. But in the kitchen, Edward sat with Lily and Sophie, the watch ticking on the table, its sound a quiet promise. He'd lost the empire, but gained a family. For the first time, he felt whole. Edward Grayson stood at the window of his former office on the 72nd floor, the city sprawling beneath him in a tapestry of lights. The desk was bare now, stripped of its papers and power, a silent witness to his departure. He'd handed over the keys that morning, his resignation final, the board's vote a formality after Victor Crane's calculated coup. The headlines blared, "Grayson falls, tycoon steps down amid scandal." But Edward felt no sting. The view, once a symbol of his triumph, now seemed distant, a kingdom he no longer ruled. He turned away, the pocket watch ticking softly in his hand, and left the tower behind. The drive to Queens was quiet, the hum of the Bentley blending with the faint patter of late afternoon rain. Edward parked outside Lily's apartment, the chipped brick facade a stark contrast to the marble halls he'd abandoned. He carried a small wooden box, Clara's letters, and a thermos of chamomile tea he'd brewed himself, a skill he'd honed over the past week. The climb to the third floor felt lighter now, each step a release from the weight he'd carried for decades. Lily opened the door, her expression softer than it had been days ago, though her eyes still held a cautious edge. Sophie bounded forward, her curls bouncing, and threw her arms around his legs. "Grandpa serious," she cried, her voice bright. "Did you bring the watch?" Edward knelt, pulling it from his pocket, its steady tick a heartbeat in the room. "Right, here," he said, handing it to her. "Keep it safe, okay?" She nodded, clutching it like a treasure, and scampered to the couch, humming a tune she'd made up. Edward rose, meeting Lily's gaze. "I brought tea," he said, lifting the thermos. "Thought we could share it." Lily took it, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You're getting better at this," she said, leading him to the kitchen. The space was small, the chipped teapot on the counter a relic of Clara's life. Edward poured the tea, his hand steady despite a slight tremble. He'd spilled less each time he tried. Sophie joined them, climbing onto a stool, and Lily set out 3 mismatched cups. "Tell me a story, Grandpa," Sophie said, sipping her tea with exaggerated care, pinky raised like a princess. Edward paused, then set his cup down, his voice low and warm. "Once there was a woman named Clara," he began, his eyes on the teapot. "She was brave, braver than anyone I knew. She loved a man who didn't see her strength, and when he left, she raised a little girl all on her own. That girl grew up strong, too, and had a daughter who made the world brighter." He glanced at Sophie, then Lily. "The man was a fool for a long time, chasing things that didn't matter. But one day, he came back, hoping to fix what he'd broken." Sophie's eyes widened. "Did he fix it?" "He's trying," Edward said, his gaze softening. "Every day he's trying." Lily looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, but a tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, her voice quiet. "She'd have liked that story," Lily said. "She always said you'd figure it out someday. I didn't believe her." Edward nodded, his throat tight. "She knew me better than I knew myself." He reached into the box, pulling out a single letter, Clara's last, and handed it to Lily. "I wrote something for you. Not as good as hers, but it's mine." Lily unfolded it, her breath catching as she read aloud, her voice trembling. "Lily, I thought honor was power, a name on a building. I was wrong. It's this, sitting here, spilling tea, listening to Sophie sing. I lost 30 years, but I won't lose another day. I'm not asking for a title, just a chance. Edward." She looked up, her eyes searching his, and for the first time she didn't turn away. "You're different," she said, finally, not the man she wrote about. "I'm trying to be," he replied, his voice steady. "That's all I've got left to give." Sophie climbed into his lap, spilling tea on his shirt, and giggled. "You're messy again, Grandpa." Edward laughed, a rare, rough sound, and wiped the stain with a napkin, letting her stay. Lily watched, her smile growing, and joined them at the table. The 3 sat there, the watch ticking between them, its rhythm a quiet hymn to a new beginning. Outside, the world moved on. Victor's face graced the evening news. Crane takes helm at Grayson Enterprises. But the company held steady, its foundation too strong to crumble. Edward's absence didn't break it. His legacy wasn't the tower, but the people who'd trusted him. He didn't watch the broadcast. Instead, he stayed in the kitchen, teaching Sophie to pour tea, her small hands guided by his larger ones. "Slow now," he said, steadying the pot as water splashed. "You'll get it." "Like you did?" she asked, grinning. "Exactly," he said, his eyes crinkling. Lily handed him a towel, her touch lingering a moment, a silent bridge between them. Later, as dusk settled, Edward stepped onto the stoop, the city's lights a faint glow in the distance. He looked back at the apartment, Sophie's laughter drifting through the cracked window, and felt a peace he'd never known in boardrooms or penthouses. The watch ticked in his pocket, a companion to the rhythm of his breath. He'd lost the empire, but found something greater. Family, honor, a dignity not bestowed by titles, but earned through presence. Driving home, the mansion loomed ahead, its white walls stark against the night. Edward parked but didn't go inside. He sat in the car, the thermos beside him, and closed his eyes. Clara's voice whispered in his memory, "Something to remember me by," and he smiled, faint but real. Honor wasn't the lights fading behind him, it was the warmth waiting ahead. He'd keep showing up, spilling tea, telling stories, until the debt of 30 years was paid, not with money, but with time. And that, he knew, was enough. If this journey of resilience, honor, and quiet triumph touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up. It means the world to me. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter of stories that lift the spirit and celebrate the strength within us all. Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what moved you most. Until next time, keep holding on to what matters.